Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to the third of our webinar series where we'll be looking at how to adapt communications to the new world of remote working and social distancing. In short, now's the time for all of us to take our brand communications properly online. Websites, pitch decks, thought leadership content, press releases and investor calls that work much, much harder in order to connect and engage in a much more powerful and crucially online way. So with journalists working under unusual constraints and pressures and corporate events happening unexpectedly, we've noticed that it's creating more mistakes than usual. We had one Wall Street Journal headline this week, for example, which made it look like an asset manager was penalizing redemptions with penalty fees. This was extremely damaging and extremely wrong. So in this webinar, we're going to look at what can be done to prepare so that you don't get caught like a rabbit in the headlights if a media crisis happens and risk the consequent reputational damage of that happening, how to react when a crisis hits, and we look at options for stopping or reducing the impact of negative stories, two real-life case study examples to hopefully brings it all alive, and questions at the end. So please do use the questions function to post any questions and we'll do our best to answer them for you. So how to prepare, 5 key steps. There are 5 key steps to good preparation. Firstly, reputation audit and action plan. Secondly, insider risk assessment and action plan. Thirdly, establishing a crisis response capability. Fourthly, optimizing your Google page 1 search. Fifth, rehearse and test your crisis response capability. Make sure it's all working. And so 1, reputation audit. As well as reviewing media coverage, this audit should also look inside the company's house, land registry filings, local planning applications, electoral roll, CCJ databases, FCA register, deaths and marriages registries, and offline media archives. The aim is to establish really what's out there and what an investigative hostile reporter could use or what a hostile actor could give to a journalist. Action plans from this audit might include removing private information as much as possible, taking down photographs, videos, tightening social media policies for you and your family. Second, employee risk assessment and action plan. A key action here is to use the principle of least privilege, only giving people access to the information that they absolutely need and avoid giving master access as much as possible. And of course now with COVID-19 and the lockdowns and remote working, there is even more risk here because people are using own computers, etc. Other action items include proper background checks, employee reputation audits to see what's out there about key employees as well, installing software tools which spot unusual activity on your network, such as sending information to home PCs, downloading via USBs, and unusual printing requests, and making sure that you've put the right non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality contracts in place. So the third key activity under how to prepare is to establish a crisis response capability. 5 key aspects to this. Firstly, expertise. Secondly, teamwork. Third, rapid response. Fourth, 24/7 monitoring. 5, rehearsals. So 1 is expertise, and there are 3 types of expertise required. Firstly, the person understands the technicalities of the story, as these mistakes are usually caused by technical misunderstandings, and so subject matter expertise is vital. Secondly, the person understands how the amendment or correction process works inside a newspaper. Thirdly, the person understands the framework in which the paper operates within its own code of practice or the law, and the process and the language for amending a story or obtaining a correction, or trying to take down stories altogether. Second is teamwork, and there are 3 elements to a great team. Firstly, a prepared client. It's crucial that the COO or in-house legal counsel understands what's required and has the resources and the crisis team ready to react. Secondly, specialist crisis communications counsel. This is the person or persons who can deal with the journalists or their editors and has the expertise that I described above. Thirdly, specialist legal counsel. These are sort of media specialists. These are people who can deal with the paper's legal department. In serious situations, it's advisable to have a two-pronged approach, with the media specialist talking to the journalist and her editors, while the media lawyers are strongly and clearly engaging with the in-house legal team. A serious situation involving lawyers can greatly increase the perception of risk involved in running a story on the part of the publication, which of course can be very helpful. So third is the ability to respond very quickly indeed. Because mistakes can spread like a virus very quickly, it's crucially important to be able to correct mistakes very quickly before they get picked up by other media outlets. The team must be ready and able to react very fast. Fourth is 24/7 monitoring. Because of the vital importance of correcting mistakes very quickly, it's important to have a means for picking them up, which means having a capability to monitor traditional as well as social media. Social media monitoring is very important in order to pick up mistakes before they jump into the mainstream media. For example, we recently had a mistake in the Italian press, and Rob Cox of Breaking Views tweeted it. Because we knew that he tweeted it, we immediately contacted him and were able to tell him the story was wrong and was being corrected. And he then didn't run it on Breaking Views, which would have been very bad, as Breaking Views is distributed globally by Reuters. The fourth key activity under how to prepare is Google Page One, optimizing your Google Page One search. It's important to build as much resilience as possible into your Google Page One search and to be ready to react very quickly in the event of negative media coverage. Some good and bad recent examples of this include Janice Henderson and GAM. So taking Janice Henderson to start, despite the departure of Bill Gross, coupled with speculation around a possible demerger, Janice Henderson managed to quickly expunge negative news flow from its Google Page One search. This is really because A, it owns so much of the content of its own content on its Google Page One search. B, coupled with a very well optimized website, which provides page level breakdowns inside search results, so a lot more detail. And C, it has a stream of SEO optimized content ready to go. And so despite a string of bad news stories, Janice managed to keep bumping bad news off Google Page One. A past master of this, by the way, is also Credit Suisse, who are extraordinarily effective at this. GAM, on the other hand, who fired a high-profile manager, which led to a string of bad news stories, did not have a plan, failed to react, and quickly lost control of its Google Page One. And by the way, webinar 6 in this series will focus on how to optimize Google Page One, so it will concentrate entirely on that. The fifth key activity under how to prepare is to rehearse and test. It's very difficult to know if your crisis response team functions and can react quickly to a crisis if it hasn't been tested. So now we're going to move on to how to react when a crisis hits. And I'm going to hand over to Bill to talk about that.
Thanks, Anthony. Usually a crisis begins with an unexpected phone call. Hi, it's Nishant from Bloomberg. To react effectively, it is vital to systematically collect some key information. How big are you in the story? And are you the whole story or just part of the story? What is the source and how strong is the information? Is it an employee, an investor, a competitor? What type of information is it? An investor letter, a legal document, a tip-off from a source? If it is a document, is it one that journalist has obtained, or is it a source referring to it without passing the document on? Always insist that the journalists supply questions in writing. This helps specify what the story is about and makes the response considered and precise. But bear in mind that journalists will be calling other sources to get more information. So finally, negotiate as much time as possible to respond. Next, it is vital to pose several questions. What is the thesis? And what evidence does the journalist have? And what is the response, given that the story may continue to evolve? It is also important to set out your red line issues and points that you want to keep out of any story. The aim here is to stop unhelpful narratives emerging. The key question to answer: is it a story you want to work with and shape or dilute, or is it one that it is possible to stop? When considering a response on the record, several key questions need to be answered. What happened? Why did it happen? Has this happened before? Will it happen again? And if not, why not? Since this amounts to a pledge there must be good reasons and plausible evidence to support this assertion. And if you don't know the answers to these questions, it is better to delay, collect the relevant facts, and prepare answers. So now we can quickly consider options for stopping the story or reducing its impact. The framework for understanding these options breaks down into three components. 1, is there room to negotiate with the journalist? 2, do codes of conduct of the media organization apply to this story? 3, does the law offer potential recourse? In most cases, negotiating with the journalist is where our work usually begins. To summarize the key stages of negotiation, we have come up with a handy mnemonic summarized by the 4 Ds: diversion, delay, detail, and defense. Diversion really is about diverting the journalist to a bigger, better, and different story, perhaps providing broader context and more information to fuel that story. Delay often involves offering a better or more detailed story down the line, perhaps a profile or the promise of an on-the-record quote. Detail involves intensive detailed background briefings that shape and effectively dilute your part in the, as a result, much bigger story. And finally, defense. This is when the journalist isn't going to budge and they are very confident of their sourcing. In this case, the journalist will usually run an on-the-record denial.
Thanks, Bill. So turning to codes of conduct protections. So most media will have their own codes of conduct, and these are mainly based around 3 core principles of accuracy. Is the story factual and in line with identifiable facts? Fairness, and rights to or exclusions to rights to privacy. So looking at the regulatory protections, these principles are very reflective of the regulators' principles, hence accuracy, fairness, and privacy. And of course, there's a lot of detail in there around, say, clandestine devices and the use of, and the defense even of using those in the public interest. The main point here is that if you can show that a story is not accurate, you'll have a strong case, and it is very likely you'll be able to amend or correct a story. It's obviously less easy to show that a story is unfair. So moving on to the legal options, again, these broadly revolve around principles of accuracy, as in the defendant has made false statements or is actively or maliciously lying, fairness, and privacy, as in breach of privacy or confidentiality. So the way these principles are applied between countries and regions, say the US and the UK, vary, and they also vary between different states within the US. The important point to remember is that accuracy is always a strong point. It's the gray area around fairness or opinion where it can be harder to fight your corner in the United States because of the First Amendment protections for freedom of speech. As to privacy, the nuance is that the UK and Europe is much more concerned about protecting individual freedoms and liberties. Hence, privacy is more important, and this is reflected by the large body of common law, as well as legislation protecting privacy such as GDPR, European Convention of Human Rights, and in the UK, the Data Protection Act, etc. While the US law is much more concerned about protecting property rights. So you would tend to use things that protect property, like copyright and trademarks, for example, to control your photos or items you've written, such as an investor letter, for example. So running through some of these legal protections. The first and best known is defamation. In this case, you have to prove that the defendant made a statement, that the statement was published, that the statement caused injury to reputation, and a slight oddity here is the claimant doesn't have to prove that the statement is false. If he can prove that the statement is defamatory, it's assumed it's false and has proved otherwise. So the burden shifts onto the defendant to do that, and that the statement didn't fall into a privileged category. A current use of defamation law in the US is by the Trump election campaign, which has issued defamation lawsuits this week against CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post for running a defamatory advertisement, i.e. this ad was critical of Mr. Trump's handling of the COVID-19 crisis. The tactic here is not necessary to win these cases, but it certainly provides a very strong shot across the bows of the media, as they will need to take account of the risks and costs that they may incur for running their fair comment or opinion. The lawsuits here seek unspecified damages. The second is malicious falsehood. Both defamation and malicious falsehood deal with the publication of false statements. The main difference between the two is that the claimant in a malicious falsehood claim doesn't have to prove any damage to reputation, but they do have to prove the statement is false and it did cause actual financial loss. Malicious falsehood is often added to a defamation claim in order to cover all the bases. Two examples of malicious falsehood affecting Elon Musk. In one recent famous case, the claimant, Mr. Unsworth, alleged that it was malicious and false and financially damaging to him to call him a pedo guy on Twitter. And conversely, Mr. Musk claimed against the BBC when Jeremy Clarkson's statements on Top Gear that Tesla cars didn't have much of a charging range were both malicious and false and caused financial loss to Tesla. A third option is a claim under the Data Protection Act. To be successful, you don't have to prove defamation or damage, only that the information that's been stored and has been used is inaccurate. A fourth option, and which has been quite effective in recent times, is breach of confidence. An example of recent successful case is when an investor shared an investor letter with the journalist. The letter was protected by an NDA and an injunction was therefore granted. So the burden of proof is on the media, and it's quite high if there's an NDA in place. An injunction can be granted even when no public interest exists. So I'm just going to hand over to Bill, where we've got a real live example of something that happened recently.
Thanks, Anthony. In this case study, I think it's very important how it illustrates the need for expertise and speed. The subhead of a Wall Street Journal story claimed an asset manager had added a redemption penalty when it was a sub-advisor with a separate board and legal entity that had done so. The story was wrong and very damaging to the asset manager. Before alerting us, the asset manager's legal counsel sent a long letter to the journalists that flagged the key error but raised a number of less serious matters. This led to delays in obtaining an immediate correction of the key mistake. Once Peregrine became engaged, we worked directly with the journalists and editors using an established formula to seek and achieve a rapid correction. While this was ongoing, key global financial media who would see the story and might seek to cover it were contacted and informed that it was incorrect and that a correction was pending. As well, immediate correction was sought from several website aggregators repeating the story. When the Wall Street Journal agreed to revise and the subhead was amended with a correction notice, this then resulted in the notice being put into the archive story. Other website aggregators were contacted and their summaries got corrected or deleted. The outcome was that the Wall Street Journal story was corrected and a permanent correction is now in the database of the newspaper's articles. No other Tier 1 media repeated the story and all aggregators updated with the correct story.
Thanks, Bill. So this case illustrates the vital importance of 24/7 monitoring and response and great teamwork. So this was a UK-based business, and the story, though, kicked off in the US at 7 p.m. Over the course of the first 48 hours after the initial inaccurate article appeared, a total of 67 online articles were corrected, including online aggregators with no actual authors. So that meant we had to contact domain administrators and get those links removed. So 25 links were removed in that time. By 4 a.m., 33 real-time corrections across 2 continents had been made. By 6 a.m., 55 real-time corrections across 3 continents had been made. And by 9 a.m. GMT the following day in London, 67 corrections had already been made. So clearly, if you were waking up at 9 a.m. the next day and trying to deal with the situation then, it would be very, very, very late in the day and you'd have a massive problem. So this is a team of 5 people on our side, plus lawyers working in shifts. And this level of activity persisted for a further 48 hours and then started to die down. But that can show you the sort of scale of response that was required and the kind of persistence that's required as well. So there you have it. We're now going to move into questions, and I do have a few questions here. A question here from Peter. How successful are you at stopping stories? So I'm going to just ask Bill to address that.
Thanks, Anthony. That's a good question, Peter. I mean, generally speaking, if a story is inaccurate, it's usually pretty straightforward to put a stop to it. But sometimes if the story is technical or in a gray area, it can be a bit more challenging. In this situation, we would often resort to using background briefings and content to help refocus and dilute the story. If the information, on the other hand, is confidential, it's more difficult for journalists to use due to well-known court ruling on privacy and the right to privacy. So we would quite often intervene and forcefully on that count.
Thanks, Bill. A question here from Jen. How successful have you been at dialing down or reining in stories?
Well, thanks, Jen. Well, I guess dialing down a story, to succeed in doing so, it's usually necessary to use high-level background briefings in order to try to challenge key facts or interpretations the journalist has made, as well as to hopefully try and influence the narrative shape of the story. For example, we had a recent case where a major family office briefed against an investment manager who had redeemed the family office's allocation. Over a series of phone calls, including background briefings with the manager's managing principal, the reporter became convinced that the behavior of the family office in arbitrarily cutting already advantageous fees lay behind the hedge fund redeeming its client. The client did get mentioned briefly, but in a benign context, in the final paragraph of a 1,500-word story.
Great, Bill. Thanks for that. I've got a question here from Sarah. Is it more difficult to work with media in the US?
Well, this is a question, obviously, that comes up quite often, especially from our clients in the UK who have less familiarity with the US media. What I would say is that the Tier 1 media in the US is extremely professional. Many journalists have Masters of Journalism degrees from august institutes like Columbia University, and the key players like Dow Jones, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Bloomberg have enormous resources. They tend to be driven, I think, by accuracy and want to publish exclusive or investigative stories. This means they work on a longer time horizon before publication. But it's worth repeating. If you can show that a story is inaccurate or wholly unfounded, it will usually be dropped.
Fantastic, Bill. I've got a question here from Vanessa. What is the most terrifying situation you've faced? So I'll answer that. The case study that I was referring to was really quite, that was probably it. It was, it had all the ingredients. Essentially, the story was very wrong. It was alleging criminal activity which was wrong. It was titillating to a general reader. It involved big brands. In short, it had all the ingredients to create tremendous momentum, which is what happened. That's what happened. Turned out. Conversely, if the story is wrong, there's low name recognition. There's no big brands involved. It's quite technical, specialist subject matter, dry content. That's actually quite easy, usually quite quick and easy to deal with, as long as you've got the right understanding and expertise and team in place. So I've got a last question here from Ray. Can you give an example of what you did to get a story delayed? Bill?
Good question, Ray. Recently, we helped a credit fund with its launch to investors. We got further involved when a reporter saw an updated LinkedIn profile of one of the principals and realized that a new venture was up and running. The manager wanted some breathing room to set up operations, so Peregrine spoke to the journalist and negotiated an extension. This meant the story was delayed by about 6 weeks in exchange for Peregrine facilitating the journalist with an exclusive, including valuable background detail on the fund launch. That story eventually ran and was widely picked up by other media.
Fantastic. So thanks for that, Bill. And so look, thank you very much indeed for attending. We hope you found this webinar useful and actionable. In our next webinar, which is next Friday, we're going to address how asset managers can create stronger ESG content and present our latest research into how asset managers can better communicate their ESG edge. And insights are going to include where are the new frontiers in the debates around ESG investment, which ESG themes should asset managers be prioritizing in their content marketing strategies. And we have a great panel there headed by our head of research, Josh protocol, and also how managers can create category authority in these key areas. So in the meantime, do please get in touch with any questions. Needless to say, we're on full alert and ready to quickly support your mission to power up your communications at this crucial time. And of course, to get you ready to deal and tackle with any negative news and forms of preparedness. But until then, goodbye for now from all of us at Peregrine in London and New York. Goodbye.